Welcome to Eindhoven, welcome to the caucus. My name is Charles Esche, I'm director of the museum here. And I wanted to say a few words of warm welcome to all of you from near and from far who've come here, but also to talk a little bit about the caucus itself and the reasons why we are all gathered here in these numbers. The caucus actually has a bit of a history. There have been a number of meetings that I have organized, often together with Annie, in other parts of the world, in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta, in Seoul, in Korea, and in Cork, in Ireland. So this is the second caucus in Europe, in Western Europe. And in all of those, we've based the idea upon a particular historical model, which has a number of aspects. And it's the meaning of the term caucus and why we have called it caucus. It has quite an interesting etymology. Caucus, as far as we know, and it's not absolutely certain, but is originally a Native American word. And it was used when a tribe wished to come together in order to decide upon an action which they could only decide upon collectively, which they couldn't decide within their families or their kin groups, but they wanted to decide together. So the essence of caucus is coming together, one, but also making a decision. And this is true when it was taken over by the Democratic and Republican parties as the American democracy developed, in appointing candidates either for Senate or for the presidency. And you still have, we will have in a few weeks' time actually, certain states that run caucuses. And it's very interesting that some of those states run a very literal form of democracy where the candidates each have a corner in the room and the group of people who are gathered together for that caucus actually go and stand in that corner. And then the people with the most numbers, visually, the most numbers of people standing in that corner is declared the winner. So it's not actually a one person, one vote. It's a mass migration to one corner or the other of the room. That's also a caucus. And so it plays a part not only in a historical idea from another culture of a decision making, but also a decision making which was taken over by the United States and is still in use today. There's a third meaning for caucus, which I think is also important, which is a very contemporary meaning. It's used often in large business meetings or even political meetings, things like G8, etc., for small groups of people to extract themselves from a much larger conference and to have sessions where, in a sense, the real work is done. Actually, the decisions are often made in these small caucuses, and then they're formally agreed in the larger gathering, the larger meeting. And it is, in a sense, all three of these, which are both about work, about decision, and about gathering, that we want to make reference to when we call this Eindhoven caucus together. We certainly want to make decisions over the next 3 weeks. And we have two things that we want to make decisions about. One very specific and very narrow, and one very huge and almost unimaginable. The first very narrow decision that we want to make is we want to use this process in order to put together work, presentations, representations for an exhibition which will open in May 2008. And that will be an exhibition called Becoming Dutch. And the second is the question of how we can live together better than we do now. And what art in general can do about it, or what it can contribute to that question of how do we live together. So one, I think, very specific, very down to earth, and one very much up in the air, but nevertheless an aspiration that we need in order to do the down-to-earth work. There are, in a sense, three levels of participation in the caucus, and I just want to underline the differences, but also hopefully the possibility of crossover or similarity between them. There's first of all the core participants, as we call them, people who we've invited or who've brought themselves actually from all over the world and also from the Netherlands, and who will stay with us through the whole process. And those people are vital, obviously, to the development of the exhibition and to the making of those decisions. I would like to welcome you all. I know many of you arrived last night, maybe even some of you in the early hours of this morning. There's a couple of people still to come. But I think over these next three weeks, particularly given the sleeping arrangements we've arranged for many of you, we'll get to know each other very well. And hopefully in that exchange of experience, and ideas, and we hopefully will develop something which we can carry forward for the next 6 months towards this result of the exhibition. The Another level, I wouldn't put it in any hierarchical way, but another level is the public. Many of you who are here today are not part of that core group of people. But you're nevertheless extremely welcome, and welcome not only to the public events that we have on Saturdays and Sundays, but also to become more involved if you wish to. There is an open door between the participants and the public. It depends on you to show interest, it depends on you to show commitment and engagement, but nevertheless that open door, I hope you understand and appreciate, is one that's very important for us to hold open and to be as hospitable as we possibly can. The third level are the people who will probably for most of the 3 weeks be sitting in the front row, and they are the invited speakers. You are, if I may refer to you as you're very nearby, in a sense, and I hope you won't take this in the wrong way, but you are in a sense our intellectual and artistic food. You are, we will of course be delighted, and we will indeed definitely be calling on you in the process of developing the project up until May, and indeed perhaps beyond, to help us with that process and to be involved, whether it's in writing or it's in producing artwork or it's developing particular projects with the communities here. But at the same time, with your briefer stays and your presentations, you are here so that when in Eindhoven and amongst the group in Eindhoven and the public who are attending here, we can try to build up a common body of knowledge and a common series of reference points. Many of the people who've come here for this time have come from very, very different situations with their own fascinating experiences and knowledge. But we also need, in order to talk to each other, in order to make something which is intelligible to a wider audience, we also need to build up a common body of knowledge. And you're here, in a sense, to provide that, to start building that up, so that your speeches, your presentations, will be the things that we can all make reference to as we're talking in the days between the presentations about what kind of information we need, what kind of facts we need to draw our conclusions, what kind of evidence we need in order to make our arguments. So we want to come here to understand you and understand your points of view, to agree and to disagree, to nod or to shake our heads. And hopefully, in the times between, in the coffee pauses, in the lunch breaks, to argue or support your arguments from our own positions. So it's those three levels which I hope during the course of the 3 weeks will become so mixed that we'll no longer know whether we're participant or public or speaker. But it's nevertheless with those three levels in mind that we should start the session today. So I would like to welcome you all formally to the caucus and welcome you all to 3 weeks of an experiment, indeed, in collective decision-making. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, and indeed welcome everybody from far and near. It's so fantastic that to finally see this great gathering of people in the one room, and hopefully for the kickoff of something I think is going to be quite special over the next month. And a warm welcome to our guests here this morning who have come also to indeed discuss with us and bring their important and special knowledge to us. Well, you know the title of this project at this point is called Becoming Dutch, and it's a long process, this Becoming Dutch project. It began in January of this year with a conference where we started to try and open ourselves to certain questions around who we are here right now in the Netherlands, in Eindhoven, in Europe, in the world. How do we think about our position and how we live together? And how can we do it better, as Charles said? And how can art actually push us into new ways of thinking about these issues? The caucus for me is also a kind of rally. It's a cry. It's a way of thinking that we too, as artists and critical thinkers and cultural practitioners, have political responsibility, have political possibility. We can change things, we can propose. And this is the kind of energy or the metaphor, I suppose, that the caucus proposes for all of us over these weeks. And it's up to us to try and think what we might do with this kind of knowledge. So we thought today that what we would do in a way to kick off the caucus was to take the temperature, in a way, to take the temperature of our time here, right now in the Netherlands. This polemic of becoming Dutch and what it tries to unbound and what it tries to question are, of course, these age-old constructs that emerge and are simply difficult to deal with and important to constantly try and think through, such as the nation state, nationalism, the kind of normative values that name how we are together right now. We want to look at these, we want to pull them out, re-examine them, see what's relevant, what's important, and what's simply difficult to think about. And so what we've decided to do with the whole caucus in order to try and think through these ideas is to present or to explore a certain group of paradoxes over the time. And we've asked all of our guests and also all of our invited participants and all the people in between to kind of think about a certain group of paradoxes in a very open way that might actually allow us to kind of get somewhere in our decision making. These paradoxes are the revival of nationalism versus the reality of globalization and migration. And our fundamental question coming from us as invitees is, how can art imagine a way out of this dichotomy? The second one we'll look at over the weeks is the re-emergence of religion as the dominant cultural identifier versus the secular globalization of capital. And the third is again a kind of a rally or a question, a critical question for ourselves about the autonomy of art versus its use, its critical use, its social use, its intellectual use. How can we think about art's potential to create ideas and to generate new thinking about the world today? And is that a role that the museum can kind of really support and be a catalyst for? So this is also a question for ourselves. In an effort to kind of start things in a very located and kind of focused way, we decided today to I suppose, focus most rigorously on the first question, this idea of the revival of nationalism versus the reality of globalization and migration. And to that end, we have, I'm delighted to welcome our guests today for what we call a curated conversation. So it's not really a set of presentations or lectures, but rather something in the spirit of how we hope the whole day and the whole series of weekends and weeks will go. Rigorous debate that everybody here feels that they can enter into. There will be microphones in this auditorium available to everybody if people want to ask questions or talk through the ideas as they emerge. And so in principle, we decided we would set up this model. Sometimes we do have lectures, but we also have this, this simply model of curated conversation, which we hope will, provide a good example of how we might continue to debate and come to certain conclusions together. So I would like to welcome Dick Douwes. Dick Douwes is currently the Deacon of the Faculty of History and Arts at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And Dick will chair this curated conversation. And the two guests that we've invited today to also participate are Paul Scheffer, who's recently published a novel called Het Land van Aankomst, and hopefully he'll talk a little bit about those ideas today. And also Louk Hagendoorn, who is a professor of social science at the Department of General Social Science at the Faculty of Behavioral Sciences in Utrecht University. So I'd like to welcome you all to the stage, and we will start the conversation. Thank you.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The scene you see is, goes about sex in a way, but that is by coincidence. I'm not sure whether we have time now to take a look at this documentary. It's a Dutch documentary, but to have it subtitled in English, you have to go to Turn to Islam, who subtitled it to English because they see it as a sort of model of conversion to Islam, whereas in the Netherlands, and that's why I suggested this documentary to be some time included in the program, is that it shows how this is about becoming Dutch. And for many Dutch people, becoming Muslims, it's a Dutch girl becoming Muslims, talking about her marriage. becoming Muslims is becoming un-Dutch quite often. In the Netherlands, that's a general perceived idea. Religion is much part of our discussions nowadays when it comes to exclusion and inclusion of groups of new Dutch people, people from a migrant background. But of course, it's not only about religion. It's also how we deal with our pasts, in which religion played a role. And it's a diverse repertoire which we hear. I'm very happy that we have two very informed professors, both professors in sociology, if I'm right. One, sorry?
More or less.
More or less, yes, from the University of Amsterdam and University of Utrecht. Both also very much engaged in all sorts of informed debates on the issue of identity. What is it to become Dutch? How should we remain Dutch, or should we remain Dutch, and all that sort of questions. I would be happy to give Louk Hagendoorn the first word. He produced last week a lecture at Utrecht University on the issue of how groups and cultures relate. And that has been your main work over your career. The very complex interrelations of different groups within society. We tend to think quite often when we talk about issues in the Netherlands, becoming Dutch or not, in migrants and non-migrants. But of course, we should take a much closer look at the actual participants in those very broad categories. And your work has been exemplary in that sense. So please, Louk, if you...
I should not take much time in saying a few words about what I think the topic is today. But what I think means also that I try to relate the things I've been thinking about for a couple of years and working on for a couple of decades, to bring that to relate to the topic. I was kind of very much pleased with the invitation to come here, if only because of the fact that I'm born in Eindhoven and as a small child lived through kindergarten and primary school in Eindhoven. And since a couple of days I'm as free as I was before I went to kindergarten. That means before I was 4, 5 or 6 years old. I have the total freedom to do with my days what I want. I was shocked, though, after I'd said yes, I'm available and I would like to come to Eindhoven, by the second question that came a couple of weeks later, and that is, Louk, can you tell us how you sort of see how art can be related to the topic of being Dutch or immigration, or I don't know exactly what the question was. Maybe Paul knows, but... And I thought about it, and I felt sort of helpless because, well, I read books and I look at paintings, but I can't remember names of artists, and I'm not involved in modern art and all kinds of developments. And I thought, oh, art, okay, that's about, for me, it was not books primarily, but images. And if you have images, yeah, what makes an image fascinating? Why do I stand for 10 minutes or 20 minutes in front of a painting of Van Gogh? Even if it's a landscape, I mean, it's doing something to you. And I don't know what it is doing, but it's fascinating. And apparently, an image is very effective sometimes if it's painted well, or if it's brought out well, is to sort of evoke a feeling. And a feeling is something that captures a lot of things, that brings them all together and, yeah, integrates. Now, what kind of feelings should be integrated if you think about national identity or your own country, to say it's simple, and immigration, and what is happening in this country and in Western Europe at large? in sort of understanding how we should live and having an ideal about this society that we accepted becoming like it is. And I thought, now, my catchword would be empathy. If art could do anything, then it's create images of empathy. And that is trying to make people understand what a kind of experience means to those who are involved, not to a large category of nationals. Because I think these collective images, they may sort of provoke or evoke sympathy, but that's sympathy with our forefathers or their events and their history, and it's also important. But I mean the kind of sympathy that you feel and the empathy that you feel for persons who have a certain biography. Now, identity is referring to an aspect that we have in common. Biography is referring to something that happened to a person. That is your personal history. And in that sense, personal identity is completely different from national identity. It's something completely different. And by knowing personal identities, biographies of immigrants, of ourselves, of our history, of what my father did and his mother did and where they lived, that kind of sort of makes it possible to integrate identity type of identities, like having things in common, and personal type of identities. That is what happened to you throughout your life. And that's how far I got. And I wrote a very short answer to that email. What is the connection between art and national identity, if that was the question? And I thought, please, let's keep it at that, because I don't know more to say. But I now want to say something, and I hope very shortly, about 3 themes that give you an impression of what I've been thinking about professionally. I'm not in the wisdom business, I'm in the knowledge business. So we do research. Most of the time we do experimental research, it's very boring and very limited. And the rest of the time we do national surveys, and they have been very quantitative and comparative and so forth. So lots of people, but only few questions, similar questions. Now, the first thing that I want to say is, now, in the social psychology I am in, people do experiments of how groups relate to each other. So in the laboratory we create a group, Group A versus Group B, and then we try to find out how the other group reacts to certain behaviors of the first group. And the fundamental idea in social psychology is that people react completely differently when they are reacting as a person than when they are reacting as a group member. And that goes pretty far. It took me time to understand how far. Actually, the basic assumption is that when you act as a person, another part of the brain is used than when you act as a group member. And there is a load of studies over the last 40 years that try to show how that works. And I don't want to say too much about it. It's about situations in which you think that your group is doing better than another group, in which you make jokes about another group, even if it's Belgians. I mean, people like that. It's not too serious, but it is evoking a good feeling somehow, that you can make jokes about others, and it creates a feeling of a positive identity, as we call it, a feeling of, maybe that's too much, superiority. If that is national, we could call it nationalism. What I missed in that kind of studies was the actual societal situation. And the actual societal situation, indeed, is much more complex. And the complexity was, and we don't know exactly how to do research on it, is that you have a lot of groups. And some groups are big, and other groups are small. Some groups have been longer here, or always here, Protestants, Catholics. And some groups are new. And some groups have a religion, and others perceive that as the most important characteristic of that group and react to that, while yet another group is not characterized by its religion, but by other things. And I wanted to know, if we have this kind of groups, and I wanted to know that especially after the class divisions in society became psychologically less important, and the ethnic divisions through the immigration process that we were in became more important, how do Dutch people see those groups? And why do they see them in different ways? And what is basic there? And what I found already, I think it was in the 1980s, was that Dutch people have very specific preferences for non-Dutch people. And in that time we had Spanish guest workers, and we had Yugoslavian guest workers, and we also had Surinamese that had come to the Netherlands at the end of the 70s. And of course, we had already groups of Moroccan and Turkish guest workers and asylum seekers. And it was very amazing to see that the Dutch didn't say, we are Dutch. Or, I'm talking about the Dutch, most of the Dutch. Or a certain group of Dutch, I should say. So let me say just the Dutch when I talk this way. The Dutch didn't say, we are Dutch, and there you have all the others. No. Some others were more other than other others. For example, if you talk about Americans or British people, they're pretty close. Jews, even by guilt, are very close, almost same. But when you move further south, Southern Europeans, still nice people. Spanish people, very nice. Portuguese, Italians. And if you go further than that and talk about or ask questions about Moroccans and Turks, etc., then you see the real reluctance to be in contact. And we asked loads of questions on contact. Whom do you want to have as a neighbor? Is it pleasant, unpleasant? As a colleague, as a marriage partner, as a doctor, and so forth. And we added up all these questions to make a sort of scale, and we called that social distance. And we could measure or quantify the social distance people kept with respect to different groups. And what we saw was a clear hierarchy in social distance. Some groups very close, other groups very far away, or in my terminology, down and away. Because of course there is a correlation, an association between class, education, and distance. I thought, hey, that's interesting. And we did that same process of measuring again in the, what was the first country we did? In France. It was done in Sweden. It was done in the United States. We did it in Russia. We did it in 10 different republics in Russia. We did it in Russia and the former Soviet Union republics that are now independent countries. And all the time we saw the same hierarchy. Of course, different groups. In Moscow you have a hierarchy of we Russians, then Ukrainians, then Jews, then Kazakhs, then Azeri, or whatever fringe group in the former Soviet Union. But there was a clear hierarchy. It was largely shared. And what was interesting, it was not only shared among people, French, Dutch, Russian, that had negative feelings about those groups. It was also shared among people who had positive feelings about the group. Which means that even accepting all kinds of groups, they still had a preference. As neighbors, they would rather like Jews than, for example, Georgians or Armenians or whatever Caucasian group. So this is not the same as prejudice or rejection, complete rejection. This is discrimination based on social status, and it refers to the status hierarchy in a society, and apparently also in Soviet society, that completely denied this kind of ethnic status divisions. I mean, all people were equal. Yeah, we know that there was a hierarchy, but not of an ethnic type, because the communists did their utmost to polish away ethnic divisions, although they gave autonomy on the basis of ethnicity also. It took me a while, and I elaborated that this week in the address that I gave. It took me a while to follow up this hierarchy, not from the top group in society, but to see how it looked like from the bottom. And at the bottom we saw different things. We saw that all the groups lower placed in the perception of the dominant group, often the majority group, had their own way to push away the other minority groups at the lower end. So there was no solidarity at the bottom. It was not class solidarity, as you might have expected. It was ethnic distinction. It was pushing each other away. But that was not so remarkable. Or it is remarkable. But it didn't strike me as much as the fact that all these not accepted groups at the lower end of the societal hierarchy, and that happens in all these countries that I mentioned, they all want to be near the dominant group. So if the social distance from the Dutch to the Turks was like this, then you saw that the social distance of the Turks to the Dutch was only this. And the Moroccans was only this. While the Turks and the Moroccans want to stay away from each other, and from the Surinamese, and from Jews, especially from Jews. So there was a kind of shared verlangen, I say in Dutch, longing, of all the low-placed group to sort of be accepted by the dominant group. Empathy. The dominant group often doesn't have the idea that the feelings of wanting to belong, even if you're different, exist and must be very strong among minority groups. Minority groups either have come to the country or have been in a subordinated position, and they want socially to belong. And if they experience that they do not belong, are discriminated against or whatever, they feel rejected. And we know in psychology that rejection is experienced literally as pain. There is a lot of research on the so-called social pain hypothesis. If people reject you, if relationships break off, divorce, friendships end, and people feel rejected, that feeling is literally pain, because it is processed in exactly the same part of the brain as when you hurt your leg or break your arm. The pain centers have a much wider processing capacity than just real pain. Now, I think that is interesting for art, because if you can show the feelings, the pain of others, then that is a point which you can share and on which you can build an understanding of what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be a rejected group, what it means to be at the lower end of society and want to belong. Because through pain, you can also understand radicalization, resistance, the normal reactions to the perception of being discriminated against. This is one thing. And maybe I should drop the third that I have here and just focus on the second, if I still have. The second I call, and I got that idea in the car when I had to drive very fast to Eindhoven because we were late. And having good speed also speeds up my thought process. I would call the horseshoe of Bohr. A good friend was visiting Niels Bohr somewhere in the 1930s or whenever it was in Denmark. And they had discussions, and it was very interesting, and they were good friends. And Bohr brought his friend to his hut in the garden to have a chat and possibly smoke a cigar or whatever they did. And the friend saw that next to the door of the hut there was a horseshoe. You know, that thing that brings luck if you place it on the wall. Een hoefijzer. And he was kind of amazed. He said, Niels, why a horseshoe? Do you believe in those things? No, said Niels Bohr, but they work, even if you don't believe in them. Why this metaphor? Dutch national identity. First, I want to say we can talk about nationalism and we can talk about national identity, and those are completely different things. I mean, for me, being in that business of measuring identifications and nationalisms and patriotisms in comparative surveys across countries where we use standardized scales, we make a distinction between nationalism, which is superiority. The Russians are superior to the Jews or the Ukrainians or to whatever. And the other thing is patriotism. I love my country. I feel part of it. I identify with it, which is a much more positive feeling of identity. Paul is writing in exactly the right way, in my view, on it in his book. And that includes having positive feelings, yeah, about the place where you live, where your personal biography is situated. Like, you like being in the Netherlands when you arrive from India, where it was extremely hot and extremely oppressive in terms of climate. And you arrive again at Schiphol and the sky is clear and it's fresh and everything is green. That kind of liking, I mean. Like you could like Amsterdam on a Sunday morning or Amersfoort on a Wednesday morning. That kind of liking, you belong there.
Why on a Wednesday?
That's the quietest morning in Amersfoort. So that is part of you because you live there. And that includes also the language. It includes the way houses are built. It includes the way how bread tastes, etc. That's positive identification. And yeah, you could call that in the best word to catch it is, I think, let's call it patriotism. Maybe it's not the right word. But it's not nationalism. And it's not completely clear to me how, in the eyes of some some political developments that may be in the eyes of some people very dubious, like being proud of Netherlands, etc. Is that nationalism, or is that sort of telling people, yeah, we don't have to be negative about our own place? I mean, probably somewhere in the middle, using popular sentiments of that type, and it's possible to turn it into nationalism. But what is nationalism in the Netherlands? I mean, compare Dutch nationalism with German nationalism. That's a kind of nationalism of 80, 90 million people, and it's a different league. Or French nationalism, a bit nostalgic. Or American nationalism. I mean, those are different nationalisms than Dutch nationalism. I mean, Dutch nationalism in a sense is ridiculous, because we are a very small country. And that is what most Dutch people will feel. We are a very small country. We can only be great in being open, in being cosmopolitan, in following the trends of globalization, in showing our proficiency in other languages, as I'm showing now, in traveling a lot, because it doesn't take much to travel. Just an hour and you're in Belgium. In all the comparative research on national identification that I have seen, we is the Netherlands, the Dutch, are the champion in having the lowest possible score on national identification. And I know the second country in Western Europe, or in Europe, Hungary. That's what we share with the Hungarians. A sort of very low level of admitted national identification. No, we're much broader than that, much more cosmopolitan than that. And if you're really royal, you should talk that way, if you're used by the proper agencies that advise the government. But it's a horseshoe of Niels Bohr, because low as it might be, observe a situation in which a non-Dutch person, or a person who is perceived as non-Dutch, so a Czech or a Serbian, or a Turkish Muslim, or an Iranian asylum seeker is criticizing the Dutch or Holland, saying to people who do not attach much value to being Dutch, say, this is not pleasant about your country, you are not hospitable, you close yourself off, you are arrogant, then you see the real Dutch reaction. That is, the horseshoe has an effect even if you don't believe in it. I would like to sort of close this off by telling you about an experiment, and I need my notes to do it proper. And that shows this sort of reactive kind of national identity. What we did in a survey, and that was long before Pim Fortuyn and the murder of Van Gogh and all these troubles that came into this society, because apparently, as many societies, cannot really cope with the diversity that is coming over us. In that survey, and that was 1999, in which we were on the phone with 2,000 people in the Netherlands. Let me call them ethnic Dutch, although nobody feels it like being ethnic, or not many people. And we talked with these 2,000 people for about 45 minutes, actually on immigration, on immigrants, on feelings about how things were going in that society at that time when everything still economically was brilliant. It's hardly possible to talk with people for 45 minutes unless you do it through the telephone. In our case, we could do it even at random. We tried to reach out to people in completely different parts of the country of different ages, between 18 and 80. Men, women, and we tried to get a completely representative picture of what Dutch people at that moment were thinking about. Let's call it immigration. And we measured a couple of things, like national identification, as I was talking about a minute ago. How much attachment do you feel to being Dutch, to the Netherlands? Are you proud of being part of the Netherlands? What do you feel if others, and so forth? And we could sort of put all these, we call them respondents, Dutch people, put them on a scale from having a very strong attachment to being Dutch and living in the Netherlands to saying, it's not so important for me. It doesn't carry much weight to sort of my country, Holland, and so forth. So very strong to very weak or zero. Let's put it. Let's say it in temperature between 100 degrees hot for Holland and 0 degrees cold for Holland. But if you talk through the phone to a lot of people, you can talk in different ways to one half of the 2,000 than to the other half of the 2,000. And actually, we talked in different ways to 3 subgroups, and we could do it completely at random. And even the interviewers weren't aware of it because they were reading their questions from a computer screen. So we could sort of manipulate the questions the interviewers had to pose, and that was a completely random process. And we asked about 1/3 of these respondents whether they thought that immigrants should not be admitted at that time as easily to the Netherlands as was done before. But the second third of the respondents got that same question, but we put in front an introduction that triggered the frame of answering of that question as a personal question. So the respondents had to say, as it were, personally, I think that immigration should be more prohibited, or immigration policy should be more strict. And in a last condition, we triggered the national identification of the people. We said, as it were, some people belong to that group and other people belong to this group, and you are Dutch or we are Dutch. And as a Dutchman, how do you react to the statement that immigration should be made more difficult? So we have, as a person, I think about immigration. As a Dutchman, I think about integration, and nothing at all, the default condition. That's what we do for the controls. Now, it's logical, and we completely expected that there were differences. And there were small differences between the personal condition, less strict, than the national condition, a little bit more strict. But the secret was in our scale that measured national identification. So we had these hot Dutchmen and we had these cold Dutchmen. And it was not amazing at all that the hot Dutchmen were very much in favor of restricting immigration as much as possible. But what do you think about the cold Dutchmen? That was very interesting. Because even if they were very cold about being Holland, if we asked them, what do you think as a Dutchman of immigration, compared to personally, what they personally thought about immigration, you saw that bringing in the position to think about immigration as a Dutchman, being cold, the resistance to immigration rose enormously. You saw it go up to half the scale. And that is interesting. That means that, and that's the horseshoe, you don't believe in it being Dutch, but if you are in the position, being primed as a Dutchman, sort of having to use your brain to have an image of Holland with its borders and the shared wealth, and that you have to share it with others, then even if you're very cold about it, suddenly you identify and you close off and you resist immigration. That about national identity. The last part I would have liked to say something about is a third theme. Then I'll do it very shortly, just in 1 minute. It was how can you sort of, and you can already see that in the last item, we wanted to see how far can you stretch up acceptance of immigrants among people or rejection of immigrants. And I'll tell you one thing about it. We called it conformity, by lack of a better word. It sounds very traditional, and maybe it is. But we found that if we were posing questions to people like, I liked it a lot better when Holland was traditionally Holland, or things should not change too much and new things should be sort of avoided. I find it more pleasant to have a regular, predictable society. That kind of questions. Then we saw that approximately one third of the Dutch population, of those 2,000 men and women that we interviewed, actually admitted that they liked predictability, a traditional, habitual, traditional environment, Holland as it was, as it always had been. They liked that very much. And they didn't like change. And for art, that's also important, because change might create feelings of fear, losing your reality, losing your basis. And apparently, the predictability is important for a number of people, and it's not necessarily a negative longing to want to have a predictable world. And again, we made a scale of it. People on this thermometer of conformity, on the top, being hot on conformity, 100%, and people who couldn't care less. And now I'm using this scale to understand something else, and that was, we wanted to try to persuade people to become more negative or more positive about immigrants, about ethnic minorities in the Netherlands. And we had to think of a way to do that. And the way that we invented, you could say, after some discussions, thinking about impressive old experiments in social psychology, was to create a bond between the person at the telephone and the person at the other end, the respondent. And we thought that if there is a bond, then people will sort of come along more easy if you say, oh, immigration causes more problems in the country than everybody thinks. So we thought, yeah, how do you do that? How can you ever do that? Now, the thing we came up with was, to half of the respondents, we trained our interviewers to say, now we are at the end of the interview, this is the last question. Do you think that immigrants in the Netherlands cause more problems than most people think, or is often thought? Yes, and no, and so forth. The other half, for the other half, the instruction of the interviewers was, say first that the interview is finished. And tell the respondents that you appreciate very much that you have been talking together for 45 minutes and that is very valuable to you. And then end with the question, do you also not think that... We had a lot of trouble with our interviewers. I mean, 99. We had some students, and students are more to the left side, and say, I don't want to be in an experiment in which I provoke people to sort of discriminate, say negative things about it. No, so we softened the wording as much as we could. No, really, it was negotiating with our interviewers, very interesting. And to the point, I understood that, but we wanted, actually, if we had the freedom, we would have gone a lot farther. Now, the first thing was, yes, if there was this personal bonding, apparently it worked, there was this personal bonding at the end with the interview. Actually, when the question was not seen as part of the interview anymore, of the official interview, then people much more easily agreed, yes, immigration creates a lot more problem than... So they sort of wanted to please the interviewer, or they maybe had the real feelings that things were a lot worse than... But what was more important is that there was a huge increase in agreement of those people hot on conformity, wanting to have this predictable, the Netherlands, their old world, people following the rules, everybody behaving sort of in the same way, than those who were cold on conformity. That was huge. They came along massively. But we had been thinking in advance. We thought, you can ask people whether they think that immigrants create a lot more problems, but you can also ask them whether they agree that they create a lot less problems or fewer problems than often is thought. So we had, very clever, divided the whole sample in one half, where we did that trick with the friendly personal interviewer and the detached interviewer. And in the other half, we repeated exactly the same question, but then in terms of less problems. And we had exactly the same outcome. The people hot on conformity completely, no, not completely agreed, but swayed along with the interviewer in exactly the same way as in the condition where we asked about more problems. So we thought, what is this? What is this conformity? I wrote an article about it. It's in Dutch, so everybody who's interested can find it. Apparently, it is sort of, yeah, what's the proper English word? Persuadability, or yeah, something like needing, conforming with the larger concept of conformity, needing a sort of reassurance of other people about how the world is, the comforting feeling that you share ideas. And if you share ideas, yeah, whatever the ideas are, if you share them, your world is more predictable. And we have been related, and that's my last sentence, this to the wide acceptance of multiculturalism in the Netherlands. An idea that, in our view, potentially created much more antagonism between ethnic groups than that it could ever have beneficial effects. And through conformity, we understood that a lot of people, at least 1/3 of the Dutch population, agreed more with this multiculturalism that they actually liked. And the danger of this mechanism was that if another guy would stop saying you have to accept diversity, but would say you have to be proud of the Netherlands and we should go back to the 50s in a predictable the Netherlands, recreating a predictable environment, that they would overnight take another position. And we believe that the flash politics that Pim Fortuyn created and what followed in its wake can be understood through this mechanism in which 1/3 of the Dutch population is much more persuadable than politicians think. And it also shows the responsibility of people who have a voice in public opinion, mainly politicians, in talking about immigration. I'm in favor of talking about everything. I don't believe in culture. I believe in stances. People take standpoints. If you have a standpoint about sexuality, and I see, when I look at my university out of my window, I see a bus stop where there is an advertisement for Sloggy, and maybe you know what the advertisement is. It's 3 naked young women. But in front of that picture are standing Muslim girls, massively now entering the university with headscarves. And I think, hey, what is this? What is happening? I mean, how do they think that the Dutch society is? And then I think, yeah, but they just have a standpoint, and we just have a standpoint, and they do not all share their standpoint, and we do not all share their standpoint. So, culture, a headscarf is not a culture. Sloggy advertisements are not a culture. It's a standpoint of a certain group of people, and others have a standpoint about their standpoint. So it's culture is a big word. It's trousers that are too big for a person. So this is the situation we are in. Vulnerable, complex, contradictory, and artists live from contradictions, tensions, pain, and problems. So there's a lot of work to do in art.
Okay. This works now, so I'm remain seated. Thank you very much, Louk, for sharing quite a bit of your knowledge, and I think it contains some wisdom. I think also that you will have questions, but I think the best way to pursue is that we share the wisdom and knowledge of Paul Scheffer. And to add briefly to the introduction of Paul, Paul has been a main voice in the discussion about multiculturalism in the Netherlands. I think, how many years ago was your essay, The Multicultural Drama? 6 years?
8 years ago.
8 years ago already. We're still not finished. So 8 years ago, he published a very well-known essay in NSA, one of the leading newspapers in the Netherlands, on the multicultural drama. And he was one of the first critical voices from within the leftist labor intellectual moods in the Netherlands. Paul, please add some of your wisdom to us.
I don't know in what business I am, wisdom or knowledge. Let's try. To put it that way, I'm trying to observe first of all, and so for me it's a great occasion to be here, because yesterday I was speaking with students from Kosovo, and we addressed many of the same questions actually, and I always find that such audiences which draw from very different backgrounds are an immensely important experience. And one of the reasons is that we should think about the terms we use. We talk about globalization, but the metaphor we use is the global village. So what it actually means, the global village. Why do we use a metaphor deriving from a very closed and intimate experience to describe a world that has become, in many ways, not only a trouser that is too big, but I would say, you know, almost unbearable in many ways. So that is one question. Second one would be very much related to it. Why do you use a tribal symbol like a caucus for such a gathering? And it refers basically to the same. So we should rethink the questions we ask, the words we use, and all the connotations that are with these words. So, for example, the question that Annie was asking, she was talking about the revival of nationalism versus the reality of globalization. I found it immensely interesting. We could also speak about the reality of nationalism versus the revival of globalization. And then, of course, everything becomes a bit more blurred and, for me, more interesting. Because the whole idea that somehow globalization is real and that the way we imagine ourselves to be is somehow unreal, only, you know, words or images. You know, this whole idea, which is a bit an echo of materialism, you know, from an older age, I don't share it at all. I think the images, in many ways, are very real, and often what we call globalization might be very virtual and not that real at all. So, I mean, we should rethink and reshape our notions and not easily fall in the pitfall of saying, you know, all those identifications which refer to the nation or a certain idea of the we use inadvertently because we cannot escape the word we, are somehow, you know, anachronistic, belong to an old age. And when we look, you know, to the future, it's globalization, it's crossing borders, and that is the reality we're faced with. For example, the second question Annie was asking, you know, about religion and the secular logic of capital. Well, Max Weber wouldn't have agreed with that way of phrasing the question, because his analysis of Protestantism as the cradle of an emerging capitalism would have told a completely different story. David Livingstone wouldn't have agreed with you because he was criticizing the Indian, you know, East Indian Company who were colonizing India. And he was saying, you know, we put too little emphasis on the close connection between Christianizing and that effort to expand our religion throughout the world and our investment and our economic benefit. So the two cannot be disconnected because religious influence and economic benefit, at least in the colonial experience, were often much more closely connected. So that's only, you know, to go against the grain of your questions by saying the way we ask a question is never innocent. It almost anticipates always the sort of possible answer you could give. So that is a first remark, just to lift the spirits perhaps a bit. But then going to the core of the question that is asked, I would approach that question through the history of migration. And that is a bit different, although we will see that what I found was a very fascinating introduction of Louk Hagendoorn, that many of the things I'm going to say relate to what he's been saying, although my approach will be a more historical one. And then we would perhaps see that, for example, social distances measured from the native population to immigrant groups, that when you take the history of these social distances, then you would find remarkable shifts. And I will say something about that. So I approach the whole question of becoming Dutch through the history of America. Let's say something about what we can learn from the American immigration history about what is behind the phrase America as a nation of immigrants. We always talk about the immigrants, we put all the emphasis on that, on the diversity, and we seldom ask the question, what does the nation in this phrase really means? What does it refer to? What does it mean becoming American? Let's rephrase it that way. And then, of course, many questions and experiences could be told about the American immigration history that are relevant to our understanding of our current immigration. Let's concentrate on two elements of this history. First of all, I would say the history of immigration in the Netherlands, or in America, sorry, is a nation reinventing itself all the time. And so the imagined community of America has been constantly changing, and immigration has fueled that process of re-evaluation, reflection on what it is to be American, constantly. So, to give a few examples of that, in the mid-19th century, there was a huge populist movement in the United States against Catholic immigrants, because the imagination of America as a Protestant nation simply excluded Catholics, and they were arriving by the millions. The Irish, the Italians later, the Poles, many of them were, of course, Catholic. And the huge populist movements against those Catholic immigrants, a movement called the Know-Nothings, very apt phrase in many ways. The Know-Nothing movement, you know, really had a huge impact on American political life in the midst of the 19th century. There was a revival in a somewhat different context, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. But what is most important now is that there was a time that the imagined community of America simply couldn't include Catholics. The imagination of America stopped short of accepting the idea, for example, of a Catholic president. It took exactly till 1960 that the first Catholic president was elected in the United States of America. His name was John F. Kennedy. Not a very happy history on the longer run, but anyway, I mean, he was the first Catholic, and this is 120 years after the first Catholic migrants arrived. It took America 120 years of conflict, of rethinking, to accept a president with an Irish Catholic background. And John F. Kennedy, during his electoral campaign, had to insist every day that his first loyalty was not the Vatican, but that he was an American. So even at that time, it wasn't evident at all that it wouldn't be an obstacle. And there haven't been many Catholic American presidents since. So still, I would say, there is an underlying tension in the imagination of America. But nevertheless, we can say that now Catholics have become part of the imagination of America. Let's go to another example. The Asians. It has taken a long time, and I would even say until this day, to fully incorporate in the imagination of America the Asian communities. But definitely at the end of the 19th century, when the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was adopted, there was no way in which Asians could become Chinese, and later on also Japanese could become citizens of America, and that was continued till 1943. So the idea of America definitely not included the Asian population. I could talk at length about the black community in America, which is of course not a history of immigration, but a history of slavery and forced segregation. But we can say, and there I follow your thinking about many of the prejudices are mere forms of conformity, and that conformism can shift from negative to positive. And I think when you look at the black communities and the attitudes of average Americans towards the black community, in the 50s you would find conformism that would be basically negative still, where now you would see a shift in the public opinion that's measured everywhere, a dramatic shift in attitudes towards the black community. Anyway, the icons of American culture have become, to some extent, you know, from the American black communities. So, America now, in the way it sees itself, has become more inclusive, I would say. Still struggling. The whole idea that America is now somehow a finished example as a nation of immigrants simply doesn't understand the huge insecurity in America about Mexicans, about Hispanics, about certain areas where Spanish is becoming the first language and not English, and what it all means, and that President Bush now is not only giving his weekly radio talk in English but also in Spanish. So again, a change, and it means something. So that is my first conclusion about what it means to become Dutch. I would say we are in the midst of a very difficult, and we're definitely not alone in that. I would say that's true for all European nations that have been at the receiving end of mass migration movements of the last 40 years. They are trying to broaden the imagined community. And it's a difficult and painful process. And there comes my second observation that I draw from the American immigration experience, is that mass migration always entails conflict. I haven't come across one example of mass migration in America that didn't provoke conflicts, difficult process of adaptation, and the whole idea, the sequence of trying to broaden the imagined community, try to integrate new communities into the idea you have about yourself and what it means to be an American, what it means to be Dutch, or what it means to be French or Danish or whatever. It always entails conflict. And we shouldn't rephrase the conflict in terms of xenophobia or irrationality. It always starts, in my understanding, and of course, if you would look into every migrant community more specifically, you would find lots of differences. But I would say there's basically a cycle that tells you it starts with avoidance, then you basically have conflict, and it ends, most of the time, with accommodation. To put it more precisely, I haven't come across one example of a failed accommodation in the end. There's always forms of accommodation, but conflict as a sign of socialization, not as a sign of disintegration, but as a sign of socialization, is very important to understand, and not to rephrase it immediately in terms of xenophobia or prejudice or whatever. Because if I look at the American literature, which was written before the 1960s, which I find on the whole much more interesting than what has been written afterwards, because there was a time of relative innocence in many ways, of a time at least where the conflict surrounding immigration was taken as a normality and not as something you should avoid against all costs because it's a sign of intolerance, where there was a more, let's say, somewhat less politically correct, although I wouldn't like to use the term, but let's use it for once, less politically correct idea about immigration and the conflict it entails. And I take a clue, for example, of the book of Oscar Handlin, The Uprooted, perhaps the most influential book ever written about immigration, of 1952. It won him a Pulitzer Prize, and it's a brilliant book about the Europeans coming in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, to America. And one of the phrases in this book is, the history of migration is the history of alienation and its consequences. And for me that captures the pain you were talking about. I would, perhaps in somewhat old-fashioned word like alienation, I adore it. I don't know why exactly, but somehow it captures an emotion or relative estrangement when you see your world changing quite dramatically. And this sense of alienation and loss is, I think, very fundamental in understanding what immigration brings with it. First of all, from the point of view of immigrants, to think you can immigrate and remain what you were is, I think, completely misunderstanding what immigration really brings with it. So immigration, from the point of view of the immigrant, basically always starts with a sense of alienation. Certainly those immigrants coming from the countryside, from Morocco or Turkey or elsewhere, find themselves in large urban areas, because the same process happens in Turkey with immigrants from Anatolia finding themselves in this huge urban area of Istanbul, or people from the Rif area in Morocco migrating to Casablanca or Rabat, they would witness some of the same frictions and sense of alienation and finding themselves in somehow out of place and out of touch with a new reality. And a sense of loss to the extent that migration should be understood as a brutal bargain. You gain access to a new world, but you lose and you compromise to some extent also the family traditions, some of the preconceived notions you had about what it is to lead a good and moral life. And if we don't understand that sense of alienation and loss, we miss, I think, something very important. And then we should shift the perspective. And there perhaps there's a slight disagreement, although I'm not sure. But I would say also on the side of the receiving society, I think we should be able to imagine and to understand the sense of alienation and loss on that side as well. And perhaps it's true that the aspirations of migrants to become part of the new society are stronger, and the sense of rejection in the receiving society towards migrants is, stronger as well. Perhaps that is true, that it's not a symmetrical relation, but let's forget symmetry for a moment and try to understand that from the perspective of those who are already there, there is also a sense of loss and alienation, to the extent that many people see a world that was dear to them, that they understood, that was transparent to some extent, is changing. And if we don't understand on both sides the experience of loss, then we don't understand why we live in the time we live in, because we live in a time where the sense of loss and the feeling of longing might easily be transformed into an overstatement of belonging, where longing, is retranslated in the need to belong. And if we start to have that strong urge on both sides, you will find yourself easily in situations where questions of loyalty, one person declaring, I'm loyal to my group, my tribe, the others to their tribe, and everybody is waging small wars of loyalty. But when we want to escape that, those sort of tensions arising from an overstated loyalty, then we should start by understanding the psychology or the sociology of migration movement and the sense of alienation and loss that it brings with it. And secondly, basically with the children of the migrants, you would often find that, beyond this first experience of avoidance, segregation. I haven't come across one example of migration without forms of segregation. So there comes a moment when segregation cannot longer be the answer to how to live together, or how can we solve, tensions. There comes a moment when the presence of migrant communities in a society becomes simply too visible, too present, and when the children of the migrants basically don't want to live with the same sense of aloofness as their parents. Because the parents typically live with the idea, the less visible we are, the better it is, because migrants have bad experiences with visibility. So there's always a paradoxical element in inviting migrants to become part of the public discussion, and to manifest themselves, because many of them have some experiences being visible. But the children definitely have less complexes in that sense, and are more visible in the schools, in the streets, everywhere, and they claim, rightly so, their rights and say, we don't want to live with a sense of invisibility. We're here, we're part of this society. Going back home doesn't have any relevance for us as a phrase. Where is home? Home is where we are here. So, more contact and more conflict. And I think when I read post-war immigration history in Europe, I would say we have left avoidance behind us, and we're now in the midst of a period of conflict, and where we search for answers to the question, how are we going to live together? What is it that we need to find an accommodation of these migrants? How are we going to enlarge the imagined community so that we can include new groups in the understanding of what we are? New religions, for example, the Islam. And it's not easy. And if we don't understand the resistance, not only from the native communities towards incorporating a new religion that is, of course, have become part of a wider context of conflict and violent conflict, where there's a threat of terrorism. If we don't understand that attitude and the fears surrounding the presence of Islam in our society, and we immediately use words which I really detest, like Islamophobia, where criticism on the doctrines of a religion, where real fears, because there is a threat of violence, are confounded with, let's say, xenophobic attitudes, and all meshed into one thing, I think we should be more precise. And we should understand the resistances that are there. And we should understand the resistance on the part of many in the Muslim community, where their prejudices, their attitudes towards a new society are not open-minded as well. And where there is a real sense that how could we answer from the perspective of a Muslim the question, how are we going to live in this kind of society? So the image you gave, you know, field girls in front of a rather explicit advertisement. And when you try to empathize with the, you know, how an average one, the first generation migrant from a small village in Anatolia wanders through the streets of Amsterdam. You know, I can imagine that it's sort of constant bombardment on the sense of morality that you brought along with you, informed by a different society with different traditions. So if we don't understand the bombardment and the impact of this new religion in our urban landscape, then we don't understand, I think, the impact of migration, how it changes people, what the sort of conflicts are that it entails, and what it takes to find a new accommodation. So if I look at Islam, for example, the accommodation I can imagine is this, that it all starts with, and basically I would also say it all ends with defending the freedom of religion and understanding what it means as a right and as an obligation. The right of religious freedom means that I can see no real debate in a country like the Netherlands or France or elsewhere about the question whether the Islam can be part of our society to the extent that it can be freely practiced. Of course, it should be defended. And when there are now political movements in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe basically denying the rights of Muslims by saying we have enough mosques here, my answer would be we will see how many mosques it takes to satisfy the needs of the believers. That's the only measurement, that's the only criterion. And there cannot be any meaningful discussion about building a new mosque or not. But then, of course, the question is what is going to be preached in those mosques? And then some pertinent questions should be asked to the Muslim community, because the Islam, not in its holy texts, not in the Quran, I mean, we're not going to censor the Quran or whatever, that's absurd, but in the daily religious practice, cannot be the same, in my view, as the Islam as it's practiced in the countries of origin. Why? Because the Islam in the countries of origin was part of a cultural context that was rather evident, was woven into the fabric of daily life, and Islam, in most of the countries of origin, has a quasi-monopoly on religious life. And now Muslims have to answer the question, what does it mean? And that is a question without precedent in the history of Islam, and also in the history of Europe. What does it mean as a Muslim minority to live in a liberal, secular environment? Some people say India is one of the examples, that it's not completely unique, but I would still maintain that there is some differences to just the place of religion in India and here. Anyway, I think certainly in a society like the Netherlands, which has lost its faith in God to the extent almost unparalleled in the rest of the world, we are really far away from our traditional beliefs in many ways. Especially in such a country, you would see the conflict with a rather devout community in many ways and a highly secularized society, at least comparatively. And that is why many people in the Netherlands have a sense of loss, because they feel that some of the questions surrounding the freedom of expression, for example, the freedom to criticize a religion, questions surrounding the emancipation of women or the way you look at homosexuals, have become contested again. And many people see this not as a progress, but feel that they're losing something of a relatively open-minded society. I think it's more complex than that, but anyway, we should see that side of the story as well. And then I only have to imagine the way the Irish were received in Boston in the 19th century. The Irish, illiterate, from the countryside, very devout believers, who had an idea about themselves, and their religion, very much influenced by their own experiences, and was a sort of fatality, religion as basically putting your destiny outside of your own responsibility, saying destiny basically governs our life, that sense of destiny. And it provoked a huge clash in Boston, very well described by the same historian Oscar Handlin, with Protestant elites, very individualistic, who thought very strong belief in progress. And these migrants, which basically were rather conservative, elites in Boston, which thought of themselves as open-minded. So I can see the parallels in history. And I think that we are witnessing now, and there I will end, of course, the haunting question, are we able to imagine our community again, including the Islam? And there I would say, if you look at the history of the migration in America, and now in the history, post-war history of the Netherlands, or countries like France, I would say that the former antagonism or social distance towards our post-colonial migrants, for example, where you really had a color line, at least to some extent in the Netherlands, 35 years ago, where it would be more difficult than now to imagine being Dutch and being black. I think now we see a shift. I would say that the color line is not the main fracture in our society anymore, not the main dividing line. And so I was the other day speaking to a Surinamese audience, and they were complaining, nobody talks about us anymore. And I said, in good Dutch, I said, count your blessings. But they were sort of, because, if you have a problem in the Netherlands, there's always money running behind the problem. So subsidies were somehow drying up, and many people were not very happy about it. And I think this is an interesting question to ask, if in our welfare states, we always tend to subsidize those who make a problem and to forget those who try to lead basically a decent life as a citizen, are engaged, We throw money at a problem. But anyway, nobody talks about the Surinamese anymore. And I guess if you would measure the social distance, but I don't know if there's any historical measurement like, say, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. But basically, like the position of the Irish was transformed in America through the arrival of Polish and Italian migrants who were deeply resented and were seen as the lower races. That time you had the racial stratification of the Nordics, the Mediterraneans and the Alpines, and you see a declining civilization. The Nordics, like the Dutch, we were very much favored at that time, and the Senate Commission in America classified the Dutch as being the Englishmen of the continent, and that was meant as a compliment. And the way the Polish and the Italians were described at the time was really as the lower races, as the scum of the earth, degrading the American race. Really, in that terms, it was portrayed in the 1910, 1920 documents, and not by a lunatic fringe, but by the Senate Commission with unanimity, the Dillingham Commission, very interesting report, 37 volumes. I haven't read it all, but I can tell you, you come across some things that might strike you if you really naively believe in America being a nation of immigrants. It's a bit more complex history, but the position of every new group changes, or every group changes through the arrival of new groups and new conflicts. So, for example, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, there was a new layer of conflict, more in racial terms, and then perhaps new layers of conflict. So I would suggest that the position of the Surinamese community and our post-colonial migrants in the Netherlands, which are largely non-Muslim, different than in France and Britain, now is a new layer of conflict surrounding the Islam, and it has changed the relative position, I would say. It has made Surinamese basically from outsiders to insiders, if you want to put it that easily. And I'm pretty sure, although there is no guarantee whatsoever, that one day we will have discovered that our Turkish and Moroccan migrants have become from outsiders insiders as well. And I think that is the history of migration. And that is why it is so important to keep on imagining not only the feelings of loss and alienation and conflict, but also to look for what possibly could be an accommodation. What do we need to share of an open society, you know, the minimum, to be able to disagree in a peaceful manner with each other? That effort of imagination is, I think, going on. The conflict helps, shouldn't be avoided at all costs. On the contrary, I think we live through a conflictuous time, and it's a sobering experience, because I would disagree probably with Louk on his portraying the Netherlands. I think we are a far more closed society than we thought we were, much more like Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, Belgium than we wish to be, because we always thought, you know, we're really open-minded, and we have restyled, you know, a lack of power into morality, and we really thought we were more moral than the others, whereas I would say we had less power to inflict damage. But when we had the power, we did it. Like in Indonesia, you know, we fought a war after the war of 4 years where 100,000 people died. So let's not try to forget those episodes of our history. And so my imagination of the Netherlands would be not only including new groups, with all the difficulties that entails, but also trying to remember in a different way. And I was one of those who have been pleading for a museum of our national history, and it was completely misconstrued as an invitation to be proud of the Netherlands, or to, you know, to instill a sense of this is who we are. For me, going back to our history and trying to understand how vulnerable an open society is. And the sobering experience of the last 10 years tells me that we should have reflected far more urgently about not only our institutions, but basically about our freedoms. What is freedom of expression? What is freedom of religion? And we can only, by living up to those ideals, confront others who arrive with the same ideals. But then we should go back in our history and understand, if we talk about the separation of state and church, that in 17th century Netherlands, there was no separation of state and church. We had a state church. There was a freedom of conscience, which was larger, I would say, than many of the surrounding societies, but there was definitely not a separation of state and church. Jews were not allowed to marry Christian women. One step beyond that, Jews weren't even allowed to go to prostitutes that were Christian. And that was one of the only things that were really controlled. And, you know, in the 17th century, it was strictly implemented, this part of our public life. So, in that sense, by trying to understand what we are now, we can reread our history, not in an instrumental way, but to become more precise about it. And post-colonial experience has brought a monument for slavery now to the Netherlands, which I thought is a remarkably interesting thing, and it makes our society more open, because it confronts us with a forgotten part of our past. So in that way, also, migration changes the imagination of who we are. But I would simply say, and this is my conclusion, that all those who argue that in a time of globalization all these questions have become obsolete, they are, I think, missing a very important question that I would say is the core question of all our societies now, and that is, how can we still maintain a link between the sense of loyalty and tolerance? How can we have a certain understanding of our heritage and be open to the world? And if the elites only insist on openness and tolerance and forget maintaining that subtle balance between the imagination of who you are, also through a sense, of seeing yourself as a part of a continuing history, and all the modesty that could be derived from that sense of citizenship, that you are part of an ongoing history, and that you're not the center of the world, here and now, that there is an historical dimension in a society. If you forget about that, then others will arrive, and they have arrived, not only in the Netherlands, who would say, we know who we are, no longer a society, there is no place for Muslims here, there's no place for Europe in our society, there's no place for the outside world. We have to close our borders. And if we don't understand that this populist reaction, to put it in a more political vocabulary, is a reaction to an ill-conceived notion of cosmopolitanism, a cosmopolitanism that goes beyond the lived experience of the average citizen and basically tells people, you are a world citizen now. And if you don't understand, you don't understand who you have become. No, most citizens are not world citizens. Not in an empirical sense, and I would say in a normative sense, world citizenship is something like an ideal which you could strive for. But everybody who tells me I'm a world citizen in Europe, I would ask the question, so you're intensely interested in what's going on in Belgium. Belgium? What has it got to do with Europe? What has it got to do with world citizenship? Well, let's say Belgium's falling apart. Well, yes, but so and what? So if Belgium, after 175 years of sharing one state, French-speaking and Dutch-speaking people cannot live anymore together, then it tells us a large lesson about world citizenship. And if we leave all these questions and say, these are anachronisms in a globalizing world, borders don't count for anything anymore, I would say the imagination, and I would appeal also to novelists and artists, etc., to go to the heart of that fragile balance between loyalty and tolerance, heritage and openness. And there, I can know of no meaningful work of art that is not exactly living that tension, of being created in a place and that it means something, the place where it is created, and always escapes the place at the same time, because it has a universal aspiration. But if that balance is not maintained, and if we leave that balance, and say we're all open, we're world citizens now, and being Dutch doesn't have any meaning anymore, it's an obsolete, anachronistic question. If we leave it all, I'm sure others will provide the answers. And then we would really lose a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for all this informed by history and comparison, and also sharing some of your visions and some of your more politicized views, also being, of course, a party politician. And,
no, I'm not.
You're not? No longer?
No, I've never been. Come on. If you hear me talking, you would, I hope, immediately hear that there's no political program or whatsoever behind it. No, I'm a member of the Labour Party.
Let me rephrase it then.
No, because
your care for society
but that's,
is a political engagement with you.
No, it's an engagement of a citizen beyond the boundaries of left and right. For me, this whole question, and that is a confusing element, completely destroys the traditional divisions in our political landscape of left and right, because I can see it divides all parties through the middle, the liberals, the social democrats, the Christian democrats, everywhere. Sarkozy is the best example. He takes in his cabinet, many left-wing politicians. I think, if we try to understand these questions, we don't understand anything by referring to the traditional division.
But I think you misread my words.
Party politician is a precise word, isn't it?
No, but you have a clear view of what is urgent in society and an engagement with it, and that's what I meant, basically. And you were one of the first also in the Netherlands, as I referred, who pressed us to take care of urgent matters in our society. So that's basically what I wanted to say, nothing else. So, okay. No, truly, yes.
Sorry?
Sorry.
I've been a ghostwriter of politicians, of one female politician from Somalia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but having a certain influence, which I would not overestimate if I were you. But I mean, but perhaps no. This is a really an important question, also given the audience, because I think that by being non-political, in a sense of party affiliations and all that, because I was helping a politician of a liberal party, by the way, which I'm not a member of, and I detest that party in many ways. So, I mean, for me, it was a non-political act. It was an act of a citizen. And I try to approach all these questions simply from the point of view of somebody living in Amsterdam, traveling the world, and to reflect what it means to me as a citizen. And I think the impact it could have is linked to that starting point, because I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody else than on behalf of myself. And that is my individual duty as somebody who writes. And I think that is really relevant to see, because the we that is addressed by politicians is a completely different we, and an instrumentalized we in many senses.
Okay, well,
Sorry.
fine. I think it's good you make your point. You're less political than some people may think you are. I think it's of course, both your contributions have been very informative, and the question of how to do things and how to involve art in all this is, of course, remains logically a main concern, of course, and because there are so many. Paul, you often refer to the United States as an example. I remember that last week I had a discussion in Amsterdam, and there were some Dutch and German people saying, well, dignity, respect, that's important. And an American said, well, what is dignity? What is respect? We don't talk about dignity and respect. We talk about rights.
Yeah.
So there are many levels and different angles as to how to create basically a more inclusive system. Is basically what we would like to have, a society which is, as you conclude your last book, is more welcoming to migrants. That's your very last word is welcoming.
And the first word as well.
Also, yeah, okay. Also, Louk, in your address this week, it was your final closing address as a professor in Utrecht. You also made a remark, and allowed me one broad question to them before I invite you to react. Also to make a comparison between the two of you. Louk, you said there should be, how would it evolve? And one of the main things is there should be no taboos. Not among, let's say, the indigenous local populations, and not among the migrants, and also not in their exchanges. That's maybe you worded as something else. And also you, Paul, you said that there should be a very open dialogue. So the exchange should not be tabooed or not be under too heavy taboos. Now in the Netherlands, this is exactly one of the things what is very much in discussion. Some people, referring to the killing, the brutal killing of Van Gogh, some would say, including white Dutch people, yes, he was so abusive, and he insulted each and everyone. So that is not the way to consider. So where is the balance, and where is that? Your conclusion in your book was slightly less optimistic than yours in your address.
Really?
I think, but...
Oh, I came to the conclusion that I'm much more pessimistic than Paul.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I meant to say. More pessimistic,
okay,
yeah.
okay,
Yeah, you were more
sure.
optimistic than...
Yeah.
So look, let's start with the pessimists.
Now maybe it's my character, I don't know.
No, I don't think. No.
Although, a bit. Now, serious. I saw lots of data on how immigrants relate to their country of destination after having been living there for a while. how positive they are about their belonging in the country. And one thing that stands out in what I remember, and I got new data even this last week, is that for immigration countries like the United States and Australia and Canada, New Zealand, you often see that immigrants identify with their heritage, being Turks, being Dutch, being, if I'm talking about Dutch immigrants now to the United States, and they connect that to being American. So in the United States, most immigrants are more or less proud of their ethnic or national heritage, while also being proud of being American citizens. And the same data measuring the correlation between ethnic identification as an immigrant and the national identification with the country of destination for Europe are completely different. In all the cases that I've seen data of, you see that the stronger the ethnic identification, say of Turks in the Netherlands or in Belgium or Algerians in France or wherever, the stronger their identification with their ethnic or national background, the more negative they feel about the country of destination. I saw one exception this week. This counted for Turks, Moroccans, and people when they were asked about being a Muslim, that all correlated negative to their identification with the Netherlands, as it did in other countries. But I saw an Alevi group, that was Alevis. I even didn't know what Alevis were, stupid enough. That, if I'm wrong, then correct me. I heard that those are Persian Muslims. And their conception of Islam is not Sufi, because they are Shias, or maybe the Shiite groups are also can be Sufi. I'm not aware of that. But their conception of religion is strongly personalized. So it misses that heavy collectivistic, I would like to say, control that the normal Sunni Islam characterizes of the groups of Moroccans coming from the river and the groups of Turks coming from East Anatolia. So you have that factor of social control of the community on the individual social and religious life of the person is absent, it seems, among those Alevis. And there you saw, among Alevis living in the Netherlands, that the correlation was positive. Yeah, they were proud of being Muslims, and they were proud of being living in the Netherlands. They identified as Dutch, in contrast to the Turks and Moroccans in the Netherlands. Now I was completely surprised. I mean, you can say, yeah, as Paul says, and I believe he's right, after a while and after conflict and after a certain period, we may hope that relations become better and groups integrate. And many groups have, also in the Netherlands. The Huguenots from France and the Jews and so forth. They integrated, finally, ultimately. But will it happen this time? I'm not completely certain, because it requires that, I mean, let's go back to when I was young. I was raised as an Orthodox Catholic here in Eindhoven. And I still remember that world. Being a Catholic means that you believe in an angel guardian, in angels, in a heaven, in devils, in temptation. And not in the sense that you believe in it. No, it works like the horseshoe of Niels Bohr. It is there. It's part of the reality. And the reality is that decadent sexual environment, that traditional, and that's part of the shock Paul is talking about. I completely agree with that those immigrants see around them. And can you change that on the long run? Can you change it quickly? How will it change?
But do you still believe in a guardian angel? I mean, I
do.
I always kept believing in temptation, but that's a different. But the guardian angel, I don't think so.
No, the point
so perhaps
is,
you are a perfect example of the ability to change.
No, yeah.
Within even one generation.
But Paul, might it be that the world we lived in, and we shared part of that world. We both were students in Nijmegen.
I was raised in a completely non-religious way.
Okay, that's then the difference. But we were part of the Dutch history and the sort of emancipation of Catholics and the changes among Protestants and the opening up of the ecumenic movement, etc. And I'm not religious in that way anymore, and I even hesitate to say that I'm religious, because whatever. But the more orthodox Muslims have to go a very long way, because if you see the strength with which they identify as being Muslims, and I saw data on that also this week, is amazing. If you ask Muslims in the Netherlands how they identify with being Muslims by thinking that that is important and that determines their life and should determine their life, you have to change all the thermometers that we use normally for measuring a national identification. You have to go far beyond, because it's almost total, except for some groups. And if you don't make that change for opening up and seeing religion as a personal freedom, instead of a right to control women and children and others, I won't go too far in that, then the adaptation is not possible. And I think that the kind of immigrants that we have and that the Belgians have and the French have, but we especially have, and maybe to a lesser degree Turks in Germany, that way that those groups have to go in order to be able to live peacefully in a society as we have is a very long way, and maybe we won't succeed at all.
May I give a brief comment, because of course as a trained Islamologist, Alevis are basically Turkish, mainly Kurdish.
Okay.
And this may explain very secularly oriented. Okay. It's sort of popular religion which lacks a sort of traditional hierarchy.
So is it Islamic?
According to them, yes. Okay. According to some others, not. But generally, I think brief comments, and then Paul, you also speak about Olivier Roy in your book. Yeah. And when we look at the dynamics of religion, and of course Islam is very much here in the discussion in the Netherlands, and there's an assumption that Muslims should be understood sometimes as more religious people than other people. And that is something myself I find difficulty with also, because many Muslims who will say in your inquiries, I'm a Muslim, are not practicing Muslim in the sense that they listen to the Imam or go to the mosque. And that is one of the difficulties we have with pinpointing Islam in the Netherlands, is that it is not organized in churches. It's not organized like that. It's very individual also, and especially amongst the younger generations. And that is also, I think, my comment would then be the sort of questions we pose are very important, because our questions may move people to certain stances, positions, where they maybe find themselves surprised to be at a certain stage. So the openness, that would be my comment, is to, we have to be careful being too quick in defining what the status of religion is and what it does and where it comes into society.
May I correct this? I mean, this is not what I meant to say. And if I said it that way, then I should sort of correct that. I'm not talking about the Islam. There are many Islams, and we are homogenizing the Islam. In the Netherlands, we have a very homogeneous picture about the Islam. And I know that 50% of Dutch, Turks, Moroccans have a more personalized version, and they do not observe all the official Orthodox duties, sure. Yeah. But still, the other 50% is there, and it has something to do with the cultural traditions of Islam in the parts of Morocco and Turkey they came from. And we did not have the most secularized or modernized group. Paul was saying they have the same problems if they go to Istanbul or in Casablanca, and I completely agree with that. I mean, it's also the fusion of a certain religion with traditionalism and so forth.
Religion plays a role, but
I mean, the temptation to look at religion in a theological way is, of course, especially with all the debates we have about Islam, is always there. But I would rather like to look at it from a perspective of migration and a sociology of migration, and then you see some different patterns. And so I'm a bit more hopeful, although I would insist that this is a history without any precedent. So, and that is of course the impact of globalization on the ability to live together here in a peaceful way. If the Middle East explodes even further, if Pakistan would, become more fundamentalists, and if there would be a threat of nuclear war, I mean, that could change the equations also in our society. I mean, 2 planes crash into a high-rise building in New York, and some schools have been burned to the ground here. So there is a huge impact of international questions on the Muslim migrants, how they see their relation to the country they have been living in now for 40 years, and also the perception of the surrounding society. But I see much more change than the representation you gave, in the sense that I really think that one of our big mistakes is the use of the word allochtoon, which sort of tries to describe in a neutral way migrants, but it has one great mistake embedded in it, and that is it obscures what is fundamental for understanding the history of migration, and that is the relation between parents and the children. And by calling the parents and the children, by putting them into one subsidized category of allochtoon, we miss completely the meaning of migration, and that is that the children really live a different life than the parents. They are influenced, of course, by what the parents bring through an education to them. But if I look, and that's where my book starts, in Tanger, where I saw, the children of the Moroccan migrants arriving for the holidays, from Spain and from Belgium, France, Netherlands, and they would typically come together in Café Tropicana, and there you hear a mishmash of, Dutch, Flemish, French, whatever, not much Arabic or Berber whatsoever. So these children, they definitely don't master, most of them, the language of their parents, or in a way that they rather prefer to speak to each other in English or French or whatever. And if you look at them, they would be seen in Tanger, but Abdelkader Benali, he might correct me, but my impression was that they are seen, definitely immediately identified as not being from Morocco. And before they even open their mouth, simply by body language, the way they stroll the streets, the way they look, the way they speak. I mean, I guess that they are also seen as walking wallets, like the average tourist. And they basically pay the same amount as every tourist in the market. And so if that is true, then even if you would ask the same child from Amsterdam, walking the streets of Tanger, what are you, Dutch or Moroccan? Moroccan. And what does this Moroccan then mean in terms of practical behavior of everyday life? I take it, first of all, as a sign of loyalty to parents. Many people tell me, I cannot, although I have many conflicts with my parents, that by saying I'm Moroccan, I say something that they took a great risk of coming to the Netherlands or to France, and that we should acknowledge that risk that they have taken, because we are not born now in a dusty village somewhere in Morocco, but in the midst of Amsterdam, and it gives us a lot of opportunities. So it's a very paradoxical way of showing an attachment to the Netherlands, actually, by saying I'm Moroccan, because it basically says I'm grateful that my parents took that risk. So it's perhaps that complex. Somebody telling me, I'm going to marry a Moroccan wife. Why? Because I can't do that to my parents not to do so. And then you ask, but why couldn't you do that to your parents? Well, because they took such a risk, etc. So when I'm in a mosque, I see a completely divided, weak, defensive community. Some people tell me, the Islam is like a rock in the Dutch landscape. Of course, since we don't have any mountains, we all dance around this supposed rock, but I shouldn't embarrass anybody by saying, it's not a rock. It's a strewn collection of pebble stones, somewhere, but it's on the whole, the typical imam, he would start speaking and there I'll end, but I love this anecdote. I mean, I was the other day in the mosque in Amsterdam and I had a debate with the imam, and the imam had given a speech, 45 minutes, you know, on the haunting question, whether you can go as a woman alone to the cinema. And he had many quotations from the Quran to support his view that it was a highly ambiguous and riskful undertaking to go as a young woman alone to the cinema. So, of course, the question was, I didn't know that in the time of Muhammad, the cinema was already so much en vogue. But anyway, but what was more important was that on the first row, you know, 4 girls, heavily packed into their headgear, and, you know, saying to the imam, well, you know, I almost finished my studies in law in the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and in a year I will be lawyer. So, and you are going to tell me that I, as a lawyer, cannot go alone to the cinema? I mean, what are you talking about? And the imam got a red head like a huge tomato. And I mean, that is the reality. I mean, it's a very weak, defensive, disorganized community. Even the word community is already too much, you know, suggests too much coherence. And we see signs of radicalization. We see signs of everything, but I would maintain it definitely for the second generation. You see an individualization already, with all the complexities, and it doesn't mean individualization, liberalization, because the individual way to connect to a religion can also be very dogmatic, and even perhaps to begin with is dogmatic. So that would be my answer to this question about Islam, but I would really like to distinguish between the way people identify themselves and their practical day-to-day behavior, which is far more complex and changes far more than people would acknowledge themselves.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much. I think it's high time. I'm not sure how much time still left.
2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes, something like that. So this is ample. Yes, okay. I would like to invite comments, questions from the audience, and there is a mic somewhere, or already this, or this there. Yeah.
They can just bring it to the
Yeah.
I was trying to tease out some differences between the two of you, because of course that's always interesting, particularly in the name of conflict, which you advised us, and I think the Netherlands could in some sense do more of, at least on the political stage. I wanted to ask both of you about the question of the responsibility of the media and of politicians. I'm wrapping those two together, and I know that they're separate. But it seems to me that what Professor Hagendoorn was speaking about was precisely about that responsibility in relation to the idea of conformity, in relationship to the idea of the horseshoe of Niels Bohr. In other words, that there are certain roles of leadership or roles of guidance which presumably exist at levels of media and politician. You might suggest other possibilities. And I wonder how the significance of that to the kinds of developments we might expect. Whereas, Paul, you seem to really underplay the notion of the media and politicians and their significance within questions of identity formation. You seem to think that it's more a question of psychology, of social psychology, that's at stake, and that basically the politicians are simply the products of that social psychology rather than people who could take an active role. So for me, there was a difference in the emphasis that you were giving to, let's say for the sake of argument, politicians in the media rather than the media in general. Politicians in the media, the public space of the media, and how that is spoken about. And particularly somebody like Eindhoven Ali or Rita Verdonk or Geert Wilders, or these people, are they useful in their desire for conflict, which you want to see, or are they attracting the conformist elements of the Dutch society in or pulling them in a dangerous direction?
Look.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, you have complete freedom to phrase the question this way, but I would not have phrased it this way. Yeah, but by... Oh yeah, I want... Now, yeah, the politicians have the complete freedom to say what they want to say as politicians and as citizens, but that doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. And that doesn't mean that it would not have an influence on certain people. And again, that is part of the democratic process. So no, yes, they have the responsibility, and yes, they are free to do it. I mean, this is the ball game in this country. We have a liberal democracy, and everybody, within the normal limits of the rights people have the freedom to speak about what they think is important. They have the freedom of thought and they have the freedom of religion. What is not acceptable, of course, but you know that as well as I do, that people sort of create feelings of hatred that lead to violence between people or between groups. So there is a limit, and that limit is vague, and it's sort of in the clothes of terms as decency and carefulness and prudence, etc. And the Dutch culture is pretty blunt. It's as blunt as when we go to Indonesia and we ask a person a question and the person can't say no, and we don't know that, so we press him for a no, and we don't know that that is impolite. Now, we are blunt people. We want to know the truth, and we want to have it directly. That's also acceptable. What is not acceptable is that people would not be able to speak out in their carefulness about violation of individual rights. If I would be in a community that requires from me as a child that I cannot go to school, or I'm a wife and I'm obliged to do everything that my husband says, and I do not have the freedom to leave the community, then that is against the rule of a liberal democracy. You always, as a person, have to have the right of exit. And if there are groups that have these rules of suppression, then you have to speak out against it. And if others say, oh, now you're bending rules, that shouldn't be said, that's prejudice, or etc., then I would say everybody can say what she wants to a certain degree. The holiness of a holy prophet isn't becoming less when somebody is making an unholy picture of it. And that's the same with words. So, yes, Theo van Gogh, in my personal view, was undecent. I didn't like what he was saying. I hope that I would not have been doing the same, and what was disgusting, but he was free to do it. And nobody can put him down for it. That is not acceptable, that's a crime. Now, those are the rules. And everybody who agrees with those rules can do, within the limit of the rules, whatever he or she wants.
And Paul, do you think there needs for certain degrees of censorship? For
certain degrees of censorship. Well, I side basically with those who say we should be willing to take a risk. First of all, the use of the word conformism is very conformist, the way you use it. Why? Because conformism for you means somebody, with whom you disagree. With whom you disagree. But there's also a conformism of those with whom you do agree. Let's start from there, Let's start to ask and force ourselves to ask that question. That are conformisms, which tell you basically you have to be open-minded to this, or you should be closed. I mean, there's also conformism, which we used to call conformism like political correctness or whatever. There's a conformism on many sides. So let's start from there. I would always take, let's say, the invitation to self-reflection, to self-doubt. Also about my own temptations towards other kinds of conformism. Like John le Carré says in The Little Drummer Girl, a rebel is he or she who is looking for a better conformity. Which is a beautiful phrase which should all those who were active in the 1960s and beyond give some cause for reflection. Okay. Then, behind the question of the media and the politicians is always a question of manipulation of innocent people. Sure. And I don't believe in that innocence that much, because I think it was basically the other way around. You could already seen and Louk refer to it. I think all the evidence shows in the Netherlands, for example, that already in the 1980s, but definitely in the beginning of the 1990s, there was already at least 1/3 of our population basically asking for authoritarian leadership, stronger sentences, fewer immigrants, etc. So this whole attitude, and with all the connotations it has, was already forming itself in society, and it took 10 to 15 years to find a credible, more or less credible, political translation of it. But to say, it was the politicians who stirred up something that was basically harmonious That is the attitude of part of our elites. You know, they say we've lost the ability to live together with migrants. I say we never had it, and now it becomes difficult, and now we are forced to rethink a lot of our freedoms and our intolerance, or our so-called tolerance, which was basically often indifference. So now it becomes interesting, and for me, the shock of immigration means that we are forced to rethink who we are. So that, but I would take the media, you know, like Geert Mak, our famous historian and writer. I mean, he was saying, you know, reflecting on the period after the murder of Theo van Gogh. And he was saying, you know, the media was stirring up all kinds of emotions. And I've been through this ordeal, I mean, of all these media appearances and debates, etc. And my memory of it was completely different. Because my gut feeling was that there was a huge attempt to do exactly the opposite, to, you know, to hear Moroccan youth speaking about their experience of discrimination, etc., etc., and to very much understand the sort of resentment on the other side, so to say. And anyway, that there was far more of self-doubt in the media than the idea of, you know, it was stirring up nationalist sentiment. And research done by the University of Amsterdam of the media, what happened in the first month after the murder of Van Gogh, shows that my memory was a bit more in conformity with the reality than what Geert Mak remembered himself. And that, so in that sense, that I think on the whole we should trust an open society. My worry is always that those who defend an open society somehow don't seem to trust the mechanisms of an open society. So yes, Theo van Gogh was unbearable, and he was marginalized for that, you know? People tend to forget that he was not writing on the front page of NRC Handelsblad, and he was not speaking in every national news show. No, he was marginalized. Nobody took him seriously. As a film director, yes. But as a columnist and writer, well, as a film director, you could always discuss about it, his artistic value. I would maintain that some of the films he made, Een dagje naar het strand, for example, is a very subtle and beautiful film, I think, but we could disagree about that. But anyway, as a writer, he was completely marginalized, and that will be my answer to you as well. On the whole, and there, of course, the legal line is quite clear, incitement to hatred, etc. But there's also, of course, a moral line and self-restraint. But I would count on the mechanisms of an open society to produce that sense of self-restraint, but not through a plea to censorship, in one way or the other, but simply that people who tend to have really extremist views, if everything goes as it should go in an open society, they are more or less marginalized. And so, yes, those politicians who are able to draw an audience by basically denying some of the constitutional freedoms for our Muslim population, I would take it as an invitation to self-reflection. Why are those who are defending an open society in the Netherlands so defensive? Mm-hmm. Why are they not able to formulate the presence of Muslims in such a way that the reciprocity of rights and obligations for those who were already there and the Muslims who came to our society is clear? But I never heard a politician saying clearly, also to the Muslim population, you know, what I would say to the Imam, I will defend your right to practice your religion freely here if you are willing to defend my right to criticize your religion. If this reciprocity is denied, either from the side of those who say, you know, I'm not going to defend the rights for Muslims to practice their religion, or from the side of Orthodox people in the Muslim community who think it's a humiliation when somebody denies, you know, the holiness of what I believe in and the perfection of what I believe in. You know, this reciprocity doesn't work and is broken from one side or the other, and we see it breaking now from both sides, but it's also because the establishment in the Netherlands is not able to formulate it in a way that it addresses these senses of unease on both sides. And that is where it begins. Take it as a clue to investigate the conformism of those who are in the middle.
Thank you. Any questions or other comments from the audience? It's a little bit dark over there, so you may have to shout.
Well, the availability of light and loudness is not per se necessarily the same.
Thank you. I have to say that I usually have a kind of allergy to sociologists, but I didn't today. But I was also wondering why I wasn't itching too hard, and so I have two questions, maybe for both of you. First, I mean the statistical analysis that you do in your sociological work seems very convincing. And obviously, I start to wonder about it, the kind of hard facts and the objectivity that you bring up, that you raise. And I don't think it's productive to say that the language you're using, the abstractions, is the language of the contemporary nation state, of like statistical analysis and probabilities. I don't think that's productive, but I wonder then if the language of statistics is conceived of as a closed system and purified of certain problematics that take hold of larger questions of language because of its kind of numerics. So that would be a question for you, I guess, about the problems of raising statistical and convincing convincing problems in terms of just that. And then for the other speaker, I wonder about your notion of the reimagining of community, and that certain groups on the outside will become integrated eventually. And I also wonder then that ultimately is a well-functioning democracy and open society. So I wonder how I wonder if the question of reimagining community is itself, as it's articulated by you as a single citizen, is in fact the modern nation state working at its utmost and in fact instancing you as one of its players. In other words, the modern nation state imagines the world differently under the most grievous situations, and the kind of proximity of your own position to and within that kind of complex configuration. Could you address that? And
thank you.
Yeah, the statistics is not what my real interest is. Let me be very clear about that. When I see doing statistics outside the window these Muslim girls standing in front of a slurry advertisement, then my heart breaks, because I can feel part of their feeling about the world they live in. And my heart also breaks because I have the impression, but maybe I'm arrogant, that many of the other Dutch students understand what the world for these young women may be. And maybe I'm exaggerating it. Maybe the emancipation of Dutch, Turkish and Moroccan people goes through the women. And maybe you will see a split of women taking off and not being able so easily to marry and having to look out for other partners, which is forbidden for women in the Orthodox version, and men remaining behind and marrying in other uneducated women come from Morocco or Turkey, and repeating the whole process about optimism, repeating the whole process, having to repeat the whole process because they can't find proper marriage partners in the Netherlands because the women take off. That is what I see happening at the universities. The women are taking off. There will be a huge split, not gender domination, but gender escape in probably worse to investigate. And for that you need statistics, because I don't know whether it's 5%, 2%, 20%, and whether it's true that it's so massive among women and absent among men. And that is the meaning of statistics. I can't talk, as we did 10 years ago with people, Dutch people in Rotterdam, about how they feel that their whole natural environment is shaken because they have become a minority among immigrants. That kind of feeling. Endlessly talk about that experience. And I think the experience is essential. I have to talk to a lot of people at the same time in the Netherlands to be able to say, yes, 25% of the people have very negative feelings about Muslims, and 75% of the people think that Moroccans and Turks men dominate their women and have authoritarian control over their children. And if I say, oh, I think it's about 1/3, then a lot of people will say, are you certain? Is it 1/3? So I have to calculate to sort of say something about the group as a whole. But the calculation is an instrument. I couldn't care less about the calculation. What me interests, and I'm not a sociologist in that sense, I'm more of a psychologist, have become more of a psychologist, is what it means. I mean, you have a life, I have a life, and these people have a life, and that is what interests me. What did they have to go through, as Paul starts his book with? That was magnificently written down. And what does it mean for people who live in Kreuzberg in Berlin or Rotterdam, seeing them as they saw them come, continuing speaking their language, and for them filling up the whole universe with strangeness or alienation?
Thank you. Then we have a question, because indeed the term you use, mentioned communities, is derived from a study on nationality, on the nation state, on the territorial state.
Yeah. So this is, of course, a huge question looms behind what you've been asking, and let's put it this way: that for me, using the phrase "the imagined community" is, of course, saying goodbye to all kinds of nationalism, which sort of present itself not as a form of self-reflection, but as something that is, embedded in the territory or in, bloodlines and that sort of imagination of the community. So it basically refers also to the role of novelists, artists, who have always played a role in the imagination and the way a society can reflect upon itself. But I see it far more as an invitation to self-reflection. And there I would defend the autonomy of art, because I don't think, and you were asking, that's the third question you were asking, now then I have addressed them all and subverted them all, because you were talking about, should art be seen in an instrumental way, but you started should it make the world better? Well, I don't think so. Art shouldn't try to play a constructive role. I mean, socialist realism, that was, playing a constructive role. I think art should be, asking a lot of the difficult questions, should look for those shadowy places where things are unraveling, where things get unhinged, whatever, should provoke the imagination, but definitely not try to play a positive role in the sense of nation building, as it was once perceived. But of course, if you look at the history of art, it often played that role or going backwards, end of the 19th century, Dutch were reimagining who they were by appropriating Rembrandt and forgetting some of his things and taking out others. So, of course, you have icons of art which are used as ways to envision who you are. But the question is, of course, is this sort of vocabulary still valid in an age of globalization? And I would maintain yes, because for example, we have the studies of Arjun Appadurai, who writes about globalization at large, or modernization at large. I forgot the title of the book. But he basically says, that the spheres of adaptation in the concrete space where you live and the spheres of identification are growing apart more and more. So basically the image of the satellite television. You can be someplace, but mentally you can be somewhere completely else and maintain through an ethnic neighborhood where everybody watches Al Jazeera, etc. You live in the Netherlands, but basically, mentally, you are somewhere else. That would be the idea, you know. So what would it mean then to speak about the imagined community if part of the population, you know, would have completely other identifications, other biographies that are not woven into the fabric of this Dutch society at all? Perhaps for the first generation, yes. But I think it is completely mistaken to see the second generation children and their children as a sort of diaspora. So Appadua, he's speaking, you know, about migrant communities as a diaspora. People basically living, always referring in their memories, in their lifestyles, and their religious beliefs to where they or their parents or their grandparents came from. I think it's completely underestimating, also in a globalized world, the impact of the place where you live, the history of the place where you live, and of course that the Netherlands, as we see it, is changing rapidly. But to say it was once a homogeneous society and close to the world, and now it's become open, is really not understanding at all 400 years of history that were from the beginning deeply influenced by a European environment, deeply influenced by a colonial experience. To say, you know, the Dutch Amsterdam of the 17th century, already half of its citizens were immigrants. So to understand what this society is and how it has evolved, I would say we dramatize a bit too much globalization and underestimate how long already globalization is developing itself and how globalized we already are. And still we are able to speak about this society as having a meaningful history. And if we understand globalization as cutting people off from their history, and that is true for migrants as well as those who were already there, so the fragile balance that I was talking about between heritage and openness, that is something to reflect upon. And then, so the way we imagine ourselves is changing as well. It's not the same way. The media, you know, they don't play the same role anymore in this imagination. The internet will change the way we imagine ourselves. But to say we are beyond this sort of imagination, yes, I would hope, but that is something really like talking about an ideal. The ideal not only of an open society, but an open society of people who are imagining not only their own environment, but are able to go beyond that. Yes, we have fragments of that. You know, when we talk about global climate change, we have a sort of we that is global. We identify perhaps with the worries or the tragedies in Darfur. You know, a certain moment when the imagination broadens itself and includes many more people. In Europe, we try to build a public sphere that goes beyond boundaries, but everybody knows how difficult it is, you know, to really understand what's going on in Italy or in Belgium even, you know, our neighboring countries. So for me, cosmopolitanism, I have one chapter in the book that's called The Art of Cosmopolitanism. And I see it as an art, as something that is really very difficult and asks a lot to broaden the sense of for whom you feel responsible, with whom you really identify in terms of obligations. Not only in terms of, you know, fleeting imaginations, but really of day-to-day life of people in terms of where do you work, with whom do you marry, where do you, you know, derive your rights, in what language can you meaningfully disagree with somebody else. All these things that are far more elemental for daily life than the question, where do you travel as a tourist? Because the whole metaphor of, you know, the world citizen is basically, and Conrad is already, you know, writing a devastating critique of those tourists, you know, with trunks packed with labels, you know, from all over the world, and think, you know, with this trunk in my hand, I arrive in a new hotel and I'm a world citizen. Well, forget it. It's not about air miles.
Okay, thank you very much. I understand from the organization that we have to vote with our stomachs right now. Thank you very much, Louk. Thank you very much, Paul, for sharing your well-informed and also passionate insights with the audience. I hope that an audience we are less familiar with have also the sort of kickoff which is needed. Art is in an open society. It's exposure. Much is exposure, and I think that we should be exposed by artists on what happens in our societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you, everybody. I'd just like to say that there is lunch in the great big tent out there for everybody now, and then we'll start again in about 3/4 of an hour.